So, I've been making videos pretty much since the start of Corona, a little bit before, and in my past videos we've talked about how I see this more as the discovery of a virus that's essentially already here. So we're going to see big jumps in numbers. And the media is going to go all in on it. This is the death throes of the deep state. And what bothers me so much about it is that just when we had started seeing through all of the FFs that the government has been waging on its own citizens to control us with fear, just as we're starting to see through the ones that they've been using on us for 100 years. Now we have this. And truther channels are out there drowning because we don't know whether to tell you about the media playing up on it. We don't know whether to tell you about the videos of people dropping in China. We don't know what to tell you. If they tried another 9/11 tomorrow, the next day, every truther channel in unison would all be saying the same thing and pouring through the coverage. And so they've changed strategies. And like I said, it's been bothering me for a couple of days now. What can I do? Because I don't know which one's real. The truth is, if the doctors aren't even testing for it in the United States, they don't know. Then how the hell is a little truther YouTube channel going to know anything other than what you know? Which is basically just a bunch of digitized bullshit. We haven't actually seen anybody infected with coronavirus. It's just this struggle where you feel that there is something coming, but you don't know how to articulate it. And so what I've decided, and it's late, and I have work in the morning, but you and me, we're going to go through about 70 years worth of stuff. Things that are so outdated to the deep state, they declassified them. And for a lot of truthers, what I'm about to talk about is a topic everybody knows. When you say the words Operation Northwoods, everybody knows. But do they really? I don't know, because I don't see it covered in detail in respect to current events. And how could we not do that? For those of you who don't know, Operation Northwoods was an operation cooked up by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in between the short period 1962-63 where Castro had come to power but not signed the Warsaw Pact. So he was an avowed communist, but he hadn't signed on with Russia yet, so the missiles weren't in Cuba. None of that had happened yet. And the military knew that their window was closing. Castro was going to eventually do what he did. And they put the call out for what they saw as an impending need for military action. And naturally, they didn't want to look bad on the global stage. So they needed justifications for war. Operation Northwoods were those recommendations. What the military came up with that would make the United States look like it had been affronted in some way that justified war. I'm going to link these in the comments section because I don't really have time to go through them all in depth. It's late, like I said, but we need to take this trip. As requested by the Chief of Operations Cuba Project, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are to indicate brief but precise description of pretexts which they consider would provide justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. It is recognized that any action which becomes pretext for military intervention in Cuba will lead to a political decision which then would lead to a military action. Cognizance has been taken of a suggested course of action proposed by the U.S. Navy relating to generated instances in the Guantanamo area. The suggested course of action appended to Enclosure A are based on the premise that the U.S. military intervention will result from a period of heightened U.S.-Cuban tensions which place the United States in the position of suffering justifiable grievances. World opinion and the United Nations Forum should be favorably affected by developing the international image of the Cuban government as rash and irresponsible and as an alarming and unpredictable threat to the peace of the Western Hemisphere. While the foregoing premise can be utilized at the present time, it will continue to hold good only as long as there can be reasonable certainty that U.S. military intervention in Cuba would not directly involve the Soviet Union. There is as yet no bilateral mutual support agreement binding the USSR to the defense of Cuba. Cuba has not yet become a member of the Warsaw Pact, nor have the Soviets established Soviet bases in Cuba in the pattern of U.S. bases in Western Europe. Therefore, since time appears to be an important factor in resolution of the Cuba problem, all projects are suggested within the time frame of the next few months. The suggested courses of action appended in Enclosure A satisfactorily respond to the statement of the problem. However, these suggestions should be forwarded as a preliminary submission suitable for planning purposes, and together with similar inputs from other agencies provide a basis for development of a single integrated time-phased plan to focus all efforts on the objective of justification for the U.S. military intervention in Cuba. Now what I want you to do is I want you to pause this video and I want you to read paragraph 7 again and just mark out Cuba and write Middle East. Now what are you thinking about? It is recommended that Enclosure A, together with its detachments, should be forwarded to the Secretary of Defense for approval and then transmitted to the Chief of Operations. They say specifically that it's not to be forwarded to commanders or unified specified commands. It is not to be forwarded to U.S. officers assigned to NATO activities, and it is not to be forwarded to the chairman of the U.S. delegation to the United Nations Military Staff Committee. This is so those people working close with our allies have plausible deniability. 1. Reference is made to memorandum from Chief of Operations Cuba Project for General Craig, subject Operation Mongoose, dated 5 March 1962, which requested brief but precise description of pretexts which the Joint Chiefs of Staff consider would provide justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. The projects listed in the enclosure hereto are forwarded as preliminary submissions suitable for planning purpose. It is assumed that there will be similar submissions from other agencies, that these inputs will be used as a basis for developing a time phase plan, and the individual projects can then be considered on a case-by-case basis. This plan, incorporating projects selected from the attached suggestions or from other sources, should be developed to focus all efforts on a specified ultimate objective, which would provide adequate justification for U.S. military intervention. Such a plan would enable a logical buildup of incidences to be combined with other seemingly unrelated events to camouflage the ultimate objective and create the necessary impression of Cuban rashness and irresponsibility on a large scale, directed at other countries as well as the United States. So we're talking about a combined effort here that our government's doing. FF attempts against itself, making it look like the Cubans did it to us, and attacks against other countries, making it look like Cuba did it to them. The plan would also properly integrate and time phase the courses of action to be pursued. You understand that? The plan would also properly integrate and time phase the courses of action to be pursued. The desired resultant from the execution of this plan would be to place the United States in the apparent position of suffering defensible grievances from a rash and irresponsible government of Cuba, and develop an international image of a Cuban threat to peace in the Western Hemisphere. Again, you just mark out Cuban and put Islamic threat. Do you see a long-term, properly integrated plan that developed an international image of Islam being a threat to peace in the Western Hemisphere? Since it would seem desirable to use legitimate provocation as the basis for U.S. military intervention in Cuba, a cover and deception plan to include requisite preliminary actions such as has been developed in response to Task 33, which is the manual that covers the Joint Chiefs, could be executed as an initial effort to provoke Cuban reactions. Harassment plus deceptive actions to convince the Cubans of an imminent invasion would be emphasized. Our military posture throughout execution of the plan will allow a rapid change from exercise to intervention. Isn't it interesting how all these events, it seems like there's an exercise right before it? A series of well-coordinated incidents will be planned to take place in and around Guantanamo to give genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. Incidences to establish a credible attack, not in chronological order. Start rumors, many. Use clandestine radio. Land friendly Cubans in uniform over the fence to stage attacks on the base. Capture Cuban-friendly saboteurs inside the base. Start riots near the base's main gate, also using friendly Cubans. Blow up ammunition inside the base, start fires. Burn aircraft on the base, sabotage. Lob mortar shells from outside of the base into the base, some damage to installations. Capture assault teams approaching from the sea or vicinity of Guantanamo City. Capture militia group which storms the base. Sabotage a ship in the harbor, large fires, Nephilim. Well, what is that? Look. Well, it's the main ingredient in mothballs, but it turns out it makes big fires, lots of smoke. Isn't that interesting? We can sink a ship near a harbor entrance, conduct funerals for mock victims. The United States would respond by executing offensive operations to secure water and power supplies, destroying artillery and mortar emplacements which threaten the base, commence large-scale United States military operations. A, quote, remember the Maine incident could be arranged in several forms. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. We could blow up a drone, unmanned vessel anywhere in the Cuban waters. We could arrange to cause such incident in the vicinity of Havana or Santiago as a spectacular result of Cuban attack from the air or sea or both. The presence of Cuban planes or ships merely investigating the intent of the vessel could be fairly compelling evidence that the ship was taken under attack. The nearness to Havana or Santiago would add credibility, especially to those people that might have heard the blast or seen the fire. The U.S. could follow up with an air-sea rescue operation covered by U.S. fighters to evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances that to be widely publicized. Exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots, the arrest of Cuban agents and release of prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement also would be helpful in projecting the idea of an irresponsible government. A, quote, Cuban-based, Castro-supported filibuster could be simulated against a neighboring nation, in the vein of the 14th of June invasion of the Dominican Republic. We know that Castro is backing subversive efforts clandestinely in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Nicaragua at the present, and possibly others. These efforts can be magnified, and additional ones contrived for exposure. For example, advantage can be taken of the sensitivity of the Dominican Air Force to intrusions within their national airspace. Quote, Cuban B-26 or C-46 type aircraft could make cane-burning raids at night. Soviet bloc incendiaries would be found. This could be coupled with Cuban messages to the communist underground in the Dominican Republic and Cuban shipments of arms which would be found or intercepted on the beach. Use of MiG-type aircraft by U.S. pilots could provide additional provocation. Harassment of civil air, attacks on surface shipping, and destruction of U.S. military drone aircraft by MiG-type planes would be useful as complementary actions. An F-86 properly painted would convince air passengers that they saw a Cuban MiG, especially if the pilot of the transport were to announce such fact. The primary drawback to this suggestion appears to be the security risk inherent in obtaining or modifying an aircraft. However, reasonable copies of the MiG could be produced from U.S. resources in about 3 months. Hijacking attempts against civil air and surface craft should appear to continue as harassing measures condoned by the government of Cuba. Concurrently, genuine defections of Cuban civil and military air and surface craft should be encouraged. Hijacking attempts against civil air. Sure seemed like a bunch of those happened leading up, the big one. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that the Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Panama, or Venezuela. The destination would be chosen only to cause the flight plan route to cross Cuba. The passengers could be a group of college students off on a holiday, or any grouping of persons with a common interest to support chartering a non-scheduled flight. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civilian registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area called Air America. At a designated time, the duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone. Why do people look at the towers and imagine no aircraft and imagine all these crazy things when they told you right here? Just read this paragraph and you know what happened. Takeoff times of the drone aircraft and the actual aircraft will be scheduled to allow a rendezvous south of Florida. From the rendezvous point, the passenger-carrying aircraft will descend to a minimum altitude and go directly into an auxiliary field at Eglin Air Force Base, where arrangements will have been made to evacuate the passengers and return the aircraft to its original status. The drone aircraft, meanwhile, will continue to fly the filed flight plan. When over Cuba, the drone will be transmitting on the international distress frequency a Mayday message stating he is under attack by Cuban MiG aircraft. The transmission will be interrupted by destruction of the aircraft, which will be triggered by radio signal. This will allow an ICAO radio stations in the Western Hemisphere to tell the U.S. what has happened to the aircraft, instead of the U.S. trying to sell the incident. It is possible to create an incident which will make it appear that communist Cuban MiGs have destroyed a U.S. Air Force aircraft over international waters in an unprovoked attack. Approximately 4 or 5 F-101 aircraft will be dispatched to trail from Homestead Air Force Base, Florida, to vicinity of Cuba. Their mission will be to reverse course and simulate faker aircraft for an air defense exercise in southern Florida. These aircraft would conduct variations of these flights at frequent intervals. Crews would be briefed to remain at least 12 miles off the Cuban coast. However, they would be required to carry live ammunition in the event that hostile actions were taken by Cuban MiGs. On one such flight, a pre-briefed pilot would fly tail-end Charlie at considerable interval between aircraft. While near the Cuban island, this pilot would broadcast that he had been jumped by MiGs and was going down. No other calls would be made. The pilot would then fly directly west at extremely low altitude and land at a secure base, an Eglin Auxiliary. The aircraft would be met by the proper people, quickly stored and given a new tail number. The pilot, who had performed the mission under an alias, would resume his proper identity and return to his normal place of business. The pilot and aircraft would then have disappeared. At precisely the same time that the aircraft was presumably shot down, a submarine or small surface craft would disperse F-101 parts, parachute, etc., at approximately 15 to 20 miles off the Cuban coast and depart. The pilots returning to Homestead would have a true story as far as they knew. Search ships and aircraft could be dispatched and parts of the aircraft found. This is what us crazy conspiracy people are talking about when we say, no, it's actually a small group, everybody's not in on it. Everybody else, they think that exactly what was shown to them is what happened. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have previously stated that U.S. unilateral military intervention in Cuba can be undertaken in the event that the Cuban regime commits hostile acts against U.S. forces or property which would serve as an incident upon which to base overt intervention. The need for positive action in the event that current covert efforts to foster an internal Cuban rebellion are unsuccessful was indicated by the Joint Chiefs. Here we go. We want to look right here at this one asterisk. Memorandum for General Craig from Chief of Operations Cuba Project. Subject, Operation Mongoose. dated 5 March 1962. So, let's go see what Project Mongoose was. Possible actions to provoke, harass, and disrupt Cuba. This is Operation Mongoose. Again, I'll put the link in the description. Most truthers have been through this stuff. But I need people to understand that this is real. The falsehoods that you're starting to feel, that you're seeing all around you, they're real. They've been going on for a long time. So long that the ones that you're seeing are the ones they've already told us about. Operation Smasher. Objective. The objective is to disrupt, disable military and commercial communications facilities in Cuba. This is to be accomplished by a clandestine introduction of a special vacuum tube. These transistors weren't here yet, it was vacuum tubes. This special vacuum tube can be placed in selected communications equipment. The tube, which is available, is virtually undetectable in so much as its effectiveness is due to the insertion of a chemical compound in the base of the tube. The chemical, when heated, becomes a conductor, and when cool, a non-conductor. Operation Breakup. To clandestinely introduce corrosive materials to cause aircraft, vehicle, or boat accidents. This activity, if possible, should be aimed primarily toward the Soviet-provided aircraft. If properly accomplished, it would degrade confidence in the equipment, increase supply and maintenance problems, and would seriously affect combat capability. Operation Cover-Up. The objective is to convince the Communist government of Cuba that naval forces ostensibly assigned to the Mercury Project is merely a cover. Concept. It should not be revealed as to what the cover is. This should be left to conjecture. This could tie in with Operation Dirty Trick. What's Operation Dirty Trick, you say? It's number 7. The objective is to provide irrevocable proof that, should the Mercury manned orbit flight fail, the fault lies with the Communists et al. Cuba. This is to be accomplished by manufacturing various pieces of evidence which would prove electronic interference on the part of the Cubans. So, if John Glenn had died, they were going to blame the Cubans. And, before John Glenn took off, they were convincing the Cubans that he was up to something. They weren't telling him what, but he was up to something. Operation Full Up. The objective is to destroy confidence in fuel supplied by the Soviet bloc, indicating it's contaminated. This is to be accomplished by introducing a known biological agent into jet fuel storage facilities. This agent flourishes in jet fuel and grows until it consumes all the space inside the tank. Operation Bingo. The objective is to create an incident which has the appearance of an attack on U.S. facilities in Cuba, thus providing an excuse for use of U.S. military might to overthrow the current government of Cuba. Concept. This is to be accomplished by use of snakes outside the confines of Guantanamo base. Snakes simulate an actual firefight, and upon hearing such a sound, it is entirely feasible that the immediate reaction on Gitmo would be that the base is being attacked. This would, with proper preparation, be followed by a counterattack, and with adequate planning, the base at Gitmo could disgorge military force in sufficient number to sustain itself until other forces, which had been previously alerted, could attack in other areas. It is envisaged that a schedule of operations similar to the following would overwhelm the Cuban military and cause its defeat. 1. Simulated attack on Guantanamo. 2. Word flashed to the President. 3. President orders counterattack to include immediate launch of alerted aircraft whose targets are Cuban airfields. Immediate launch of counterattack down strategic lines and communications in Cuba. Fleet force standing by on alert would make way toward pre-selected targets' landing areas. Immediate embarkation of the airborne troops previously alerted to selected targets. Launch of additional combat aircraft to clear drop areas and further interdict lines of communication. Ships and aircraft would land, airdrop troops, and secure airfields, road, rails, terminals, etc. Resupply and replacement activities. Properly executed, the above could overthrow the Cuban government in a matter of hours, providing the plan is implemented within the next 6 months. Operation Good Times. To disillusion the Cuban population with Castro image by distribution of fake photographic material. Prepare a desired photograph, such as an obese Castro with two beauties, in any situation desired, ostensibly within a room in Castro residence, lavishly furnished, and a table brimming over with most delectable Cuban food, with an underlying caption appropriately Cuban, such as, "My ration is different." Make as many prints as desired on sterile paper, and then distribute over the countryside by airdrops or agents. This should put even a commie dictator in the proper perspective with the underprivileged masses. So, Operation Northwoods. They describe in detail how they would fake an entire American passenger aircraft line being blown up by the Cuban government. They were going to blame John Glenn's failure in the Mercury program on the Cubans if he wasn't successful. These plans were all years in the making. And when they hit John F. Kennedy's desk, he came out and he said he wanted to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. He tore these plans up and he said hell no. And he died for it. So why does the coronavirus have me thinking of this? Do you understand the connections? Everything that they just outlined here that they did against the Castro government is exactly what they did with the axis of evil. Do you not know that there's an angel that guides this whirlwind? Bush Jr. said that at one of his State of the Unions. They lie. These are actions against the United States citizens as much as they're against the Cuban citizens. They are meant to manipulate and deceive their own population. And the only reason this stuff didn't go down is because of a guy that they killed. Which would mean they're still following these plans. And ever since Trump's got in the presidency, you can say what you want about him, but they tried North Korea, they tried Venezuela, they tried Syria, and then they tried Iran, and he hasn't bitten on any of them. And the American population isn't falling for it anymore either. These old Northwoods, Operation Mongoose, FF tactics, they're not working anymore. But not enough people even know that they've admitted to this. The United States government did not change their actions. And you want to know how I know? I'll show you how I know.
And members of the committee, my name is Nayirah, and I just came out of Kuwait. My sister, with my 5-day-old nephew, traveled across the desert to safety. There was no milk available for the baby in Kuwait. They barely escaped when their car was stuck in the desert sand, and help came from Saudi Arabia. I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country. It's the second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew.
Except that none of that was true. It was all the result of a public relations and lobbying firm called Hill and Knowlton. On October 10, 1990, as the Bush administration stepped up war preparations against Iraq, H&K, on behalf of the Kuwaiti government, presented 15-year-old Nayirah before the House Human Rights Caucus, passed off as an ordinary Kuwaiti with first-hand knowledge of atrocities committed by the Iraqi army. She testified tearfully before the Congress. Supposedly fearing reprisals against her family, Nayirah did not reveal her last name to the press or Congress, nor did this apparently disinterested witness mention that she was the daughter of Sheikh Saad al-Nasir al-Sabah, Kuwait's ambassador to the U.S. As Americans were being prepared for war, her story, which turned out to be impossible to corroborate, became the centerpiece of a finely tuned public relations campaign orchestrated by H&K and coordinated with the White House on behalf of the government of Kuwait and its front group, Citizens for a Free Kuwait. In May of 1991, CFK was folded into the Washington-based Kuwait America Foundation. CFK had sprung into action on August 2nd, the day Iraq invaded Kuwait. By August 10, it had hired H&K, the preeminent U.S. public relations firm. CFK reported to the Justice Department receipts of $17,861 from 78 individuals, U.S. and Canadian contributors, and $11.8 million from the Kuwaiti government. Of those donations, H&K got nearly $10.8 million to wage one of the largest, most effective public relations campaign in history. From the streets to the newsrooms, according to author John MacArthur, that money created a benign facade for Kuwait's image. The H&K team, headed by former U.S. Information Agency officer Lori F. Fitzpatrick, organized a Kuwait Information Day on 20 college campuses on September 12th. On Sunday, September 23rd, churches nationwide observed a national day of prayer for Kuwait. The next day, 13 state governors declared a National Free Kuwait Day. H&K distributed tens of thousands of free Kuwait bumper stickers and t-shirts, as well as thousands of media kits extolling the alleged virtues of Kuwaiti society and history. Fitzpatrick's crack press agents put together media events featuring Kuwaiti resistance fighters and businessmen and arranged meetings with newspaper editorial boards. H&K's Lou Allison, a former CBS and NBC news producer, created 24 video news releases from the Middle East, some of which purported to depict life in Kuwait under the Iraqi boot. The Worthland Group was engaged by H&K to study TV and audience reaction to statements on the Gulf crisis by President Bush and Kuwaiti officials. All this PR activity helped educate Americans about Kuwait, a totalitarian country with a terrible human rights record and no rights for women. Meanwhile, the incubator baby's atrocity story inflamed public opinion against Iraq and swung U.S. Congress in favor of war in the Gulf. Doesn't that just sound like a multifaceted campaign to make the United States look like they're the ones in grievance? One boundary which has been blurred beyond recognition is that between propaganda, which conjures up unpleasant images of Goebbels-like fascist, and public relations, a respectable white-collar profession. Taking full advantage of the revolving door, these lobbyists and spinmeisters glide through Congress, the White House, and most major media editorial offices. Their routes, they routine Their routine manipulation, like those of their brown-shirted predecessors, corrode democracy and government policy. H&K's highly paid agents of influence, such as Vice President Bush's Chief of Staff Craig Fuller and Democratic power broker Frank Minkowitz, have run campaigns against abortion for the Catholic Church, represented the Church of Scientology, and the Moonies. They have made sure that gasoline taxes have been kept low for the American Petroleum Institute, handled flack from 3 Mile Island. One of the most important ways public relations firms influence what we think is through the massive distribution of press releases to newspapers and TV newsrooms. One study found that 40% of the news content in a typical U.S. newspaper originated with public relations press releases, story memos, or suggestions. The Columbia Journalism Review, which scrutinized a typical issue of Wall Street Journal, found that more than half of the journal's articles and stories were based solely on press releases. Although the releases were reprinted almost verbatim or in paraphrase, with little additional reporting, and many articles were attributed to a Wall Street Journal staff reporter. Imagine how much worse this is now with the internet. We see all these news cycles. They all are saying the same exact things. I've made videos about Avid Leadership Plus, how they immediately transmit all these things live onto their teleprompters. They formed a multifaceted campaign to convince the American public to go to war in Kuwait. They got a 15-year-old girl who was the daughter of a Kuwaiti ambassador to lie. Now, does it make sense to you why we weren't allowed to eat French fries in 2001? Do you remember that? They were freedom fries. Remember? Doesn't that sound like some PR bullshit to you? Not only does the government deceive us, but they do it well. Because they've been assisted by a complacent public for so long. But these old types of FFs aren't working on us anymore. It doesn't mean that they're not still trying. I can't help but to feel like our friend Nayirah here reminds me a lot of this young lady.
You all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe.
So we have another child speaking at another forum, trying to convince another generation of people to be in constant fear. But this time it's not of other people. It's of all people. And of yourself. Now do you understand why truthers are so skeptical of climate change? Man-made climate change, specifically. Because we know men lie. What do we even know of our history? Because they lie. We have proof that they lie, and yet we carry on our daily lives expecting that they tell the truth. The Spanish flu killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people during a pandemic in 1918 to 1919. What if the story we have been told about this pandemic isn't true? What if, instead, the killer infection was neither flu nor Spanish in origin? Newly analyzed documents reveal the Spanish flu may have been a military vaccine experiment gone awry. In looking back on the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, we need to delve deeper to solve this mystery. The reason modern technology has not been able to pinpoint the killer influenza strain from this pandemic is because influenza was not the killer. More soldiers died during World War I from disease than from bullets. The pandemic was not flu. An estimated 95% or higher of the deaths were caused by bacterial pneumonia, not influenza or a virus. The pandemic was not Spanish. The first case of bacterial pneumonia in 1918 traced back to a military base in Fort Riley, Kansas. From January 21st to June 8th, 1918, an experimental bacterial meningitis vaccine cultured in horses by the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York was injected into soldiers at Fort Riley. During the remainder of the 1918, as those soldiers, often living and traveling under poor sanitary conditions, were sent to Europe to fight, they spread bacteria at every stop between Kansas and the frontline trenches in France. One study describes soldiers with active infections who were aerosolizing the bacteria that colonized their noses and throats, while others, often in the same breathing spaces, were profoundly susceptible to invasion and of rapid spread through their lungs by their own or others' colonizing bacteria. The Spanish flu attacked healthy people in their prime. Bacterial pneumonia attacks people in their prime. Flu attacks the young, the old, and the immunocompromised. When World War I ended in November 11, 1918, soldiers returned to their home countries and colonial outposts, spreading the killer bacterial pneumonia worldwide. During World War I, the Rockefeller Institute also sent the anti-meningitic serum to England, France, Belgium, Italy, and other countries, helping spread the epidemic worldwide. During the pandemic of 1918-1919, the so-called Spanish flu killed 50 to 100 million people, including many soldiers. Many people do not realize that disease killed far more soldiers on all sides than machine guns or mustard gas or anything else typically associated with World War I. I suspect many American families and many families worldwide were impacted similar ways by the mysterious Spanish flu. In 1918, influenza, or flu, was a catch-all term for disease of unknown origin. It didn't carry the specific meaning it does today. It meant some mystery disease which dropped out of the sky. In fact, influenza is from the medieval Latin influential, in an astrological sense, meaning a visitation under the influence of the stars. It's very interesting seeing how we're talking about the coronavirus. And it says that influenza is dog Latin, because we speak dog Latin. In case you didn't know that, that's what we speak. Influenza is from the medieval Latin influential in an astrological sense, meaning a visitation under the influence of the stars. It's funny, it's like novel is like basically means fake, and corona is on the sun, so you have like the fake sun virus. Why is what happened 100 years ago important now? Between 1900 and 1920, there were enormous efforts underway in the industrialized world to build a better society. I will use New York as an example to discuss three major changes to society which occurred in New York during that time and their impact on the mortality from infectious diseases. Clean water and sanitation. Electricity. Pharmaceutical. In the late 19th century through the early 20th century, New York became the home of the Rockefeller Institute for Medicinal Research, now Rockefeller University. The institute is where modern pharmaceutical industry was born. The institute pioneered many of the approaches the pharmaceutical industry uses today, including the preparation of vaccine serums, for better or worse. The vaccine used in the Fort Riley experiment on soldiers was made in horses. U.S. mortality rates data from the turn of the 20th century to 1965 clearly indicates that clean water, flushing toilets, effective sewer systems, and refrigerator foods all combined to effectively reduce mortality from infectious diseases before vaccines for those diseases became available. Have doctors and pharmaceutical manufacturers taken credit for reducing mortality from infectious disease when rightfully belongs to sandhogs, plumbers, electricians, and engineers? If hubris at the Rockefeller Institute in 1918 led to a pandemic disease which killed millions of people, what lessons can we learn and apply to 2018? While watching an episode of The American Experience on PBS a few months ago, I was surprised to hear that the first cases of the Spanish flu occurred at Fort Riley, Kansas. I thought, how is this possible? This historically important event could be so badly misnamed 100 years ago and never corrected. Why Spanish? Well, Spain was one of the few countries not involved in World War I. Most of the countries involved in the war censored their press. Free from censorship concerns, the earliest press reports from people dying from disease in large numbers came from Spain. The warring countries did not want to additionally frighten the troops, so they were content to scapegoat Spain. Soldiers on all sides would be asked to cross no man's land into machine gun fire, which was frightening enough without knowing that the trenches were a disease breeding ground. 100 years later, it's long past time to drop Spanish from all discussion of this pandemic. If the flu started at the United States military base in Kansas, then the disease could and should be more aptly named. In order to prevent future disasters, the U.S. and the rest of the world must take a hard look at what really caused the pandemic. Is it possible that one of the reasons Spanish flu has never been corrected is that it helps disguise the origin of the pandemic? If the origin of the pandemic involved a vaccine experiment on U.S. soldiers, then the U.S. may prefer calling it Spanish flu instead of the Fort Riley bacteria of 1918 or something similar. The Spanish flu started at the location this experimental bacterial vaccine was given, making it the prime suspect at the source of the bacterial infections which killed so many. It would be much more difficult to maintain the marketing mantra of vaccines save lives if a vaccine experiment originating in the United States during the years of primitive manufacturing caused the deaths of 50 to 100 million people. During the mid-2000s, there was much talk about pandemic preparedness. Influenza vaccine manufacturers in the United States received billions of taxpayer dollars to develop vaccines to make sure we don't have another lethal flu like the one in 1918-1919. Capitalizing on the flu part of Spanish flu helped vaccine manufacturers procure billion-dollar checks from governments, even though scientists knew at the time that bacterial pneumonia was the real killer. It is not my opinion that bacterial pneumonia was the real killer. Thousands of autopsies confirm this fact. According to a 2008 National Institute of Health paper, bacterial pneumonia was the killer in a minimum of 92.7% of all 1918-1919 autopsies reviewed. It is likely higher than 92.7%. The researchers looked at more than 9,000 autopsies. There were no negative bacterial lung culture results. None. If they'll lie to you to get into a war, if they'll lie to you and kill their own citizens, if they'll lie to you and cover up what really caused the Spanish flu, if they're using PR firms to convince us to go to Iraq, what in the world makes us think that we should be believing what we're seeing on the televisions now? And that is the dilemma that we are facing as truthers. What to do when you don't know the truth. I think more important than us being able to come out and speak the truth is for us to be able to admit when we're not able to discern it. And the fact is, I can't discern through the BS what is real about the novel coronavirus. What is real about the fictional sun virus? But there is one thing I do know. They have a track record of being deceitful to manipulate us. They use those same PR firms to get us into Iraq. It was those same PR firms that the pharma companies used to get billions of dollars to manufacture flu vaccines, to prevent another Spanish flu, which wasn't even a virus. It was a bacteria caused by a vaccine from the Rockefeller Institute. We have built our homes on sand here, people. If we don't even know our own history, it's not going to be possible for us to discern the future. The ugly thing that I'm looking at now is that whether or not it is the threat that they say it is, I truly fear that we all need to brace for the reaction to what they say it is. Every single thing wanting to squeeze power and freedom out of regular people is going to use this to do that. I gotta go to bed. Like, share, subscribe. Or like Richie says, or don't.